Details, details. I got your attention.
Or you could just say attention. There you
go. Testing, testing, testing. Hello, hello. Has everyone had fun today? Yes? How many went swimming? So you all smell like pond water, do you? You're welcome. There was quite the to-do down there at the lakefront. I could hear it all the way up in Bethel. It sounded like people were having lots of fun. All right. We ready? How about Mr. Technology here? Are we ready? All right, I got 2 thumbs up. Good. This is going to be on Article 1, but I will first segue a little bit from Reverend Kraft. One of the very first actions of the first Congress under the Constitution was to authorize a version of the Bible for the use in the public schools. They did not fund it because, as you will see, they are not authorized to do that. But they authorized an edition specifically for use in schools. And there's a few of them that are still in existence today. And the flyleaf where it says, the information on the book says authorized by Congress in the year for the use in the public schools. Trivia for the day. So, Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution is on the legislative branch. It is also the longest article in the Constitution. So, if it comes first and it's the longest, what's some of the things that we might assume about the legislative branch? Yes, sir. Most important. Why might it be the most important? Yes, sir.
That's where a lot of checks and balances come in.
There are some checks and balances that come in there. Checks and balances come in all 3 branches, plus the states and the people. There are 5 different sets of places where checks and balances come in. Not 3, 5. Congress, the executive, the courts, the states, the people. 5.
Go slower.
Okay. So, we've got the legislative branch. I used to refer to congressmen as Congress critters, and I have stopped doing that. I now refer to them as legis vermin. So you may hear me talk about legis vermin. Okay? So the government's divided into 3 main branches: legislative, executive, judicial. This is the federal government. I want you to take out your constitutions, your pocket constitutions, and page 1, the first Arabic numerals section here.
Who forgot their pocket constitution? This is the last time you got to get it right.
Uh-oh. You've been outed.
Put it back on the table.
While he's handing out the pocket constitutions, I will say that this was the most contentious article in the convention in 1787, and it almost derailed the convention when it started. There were arguments. Do we have one house? Do we have 2 houses? Do we have 1 house? Do we have 2 houses? Do we do it by state? Do we do it by population? Is it state and population? Is it population and state? They were coming to fist fights on the floor of the convention hall. Fist fights. 2 things fixed the fist fighting. One was a decision to take the whole problem of how many houses and how they were going to portion representation and just save it for later, under the idea that if we've got almost everything else agreed upon, maybe we can agree on this too. The other thing was that Ben Franklin called for their deliberations to start every day in prayer. And that was when they started making headway. So, Article 1, Section 1, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. All legislative powers herein granted, given, allotted, said, okay, it's your job. We the people ordain and establish. The government is our creation, it's our creature. We are saying to the legislature, we're going to give you enough power to do your jobs and not one teeny tiny particle more. All powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress and a Senate. So why'd they split it up into a Congress and a Senate? Eventually they decided that to properly represent the interests of the people in the states, remember the people are sovereign, we are a confederacy where states are also sovereign, and then there are areas of the federal. So we've got the people, we've got the federal government, we've got the states. These three sets, storehouses of power, all have to be represented. The House of Representatives was chosen to represent the interests of the people by population, which is why we do the census, and we'll talk about the census in a minute. The Senate was the interests of the states as sovereign entities. And until the passage of the 17th Amendment, which was a horrible mistake, the purpose of the Senate was to represent the interests of the states. So if Congress passed a law that was intruding on state power, the Senate would say, no, that's not going past us because it is not good for our states. All right. So that's how they finally made the decision. You know, they couldn't decide one house, two houses, whether by population, whether by state. They ended up doing it all. Two houses by population and by state. All the states have an equal vote in the Senate. The people have an equal vote by population in the House. House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the states. How often is every second year? 2 years. Every representative goes up for re-election every other year, and there's a specific reason for that. No person shall be a representative who isn't 25 years old, has been a citizen of the state where they live, a citizen of the United States for 7 years, and has to live in the state where he's chosen from.
That's not true.
No person shall be a representative who shall not have attained to the age of 25 years and been 7 years a citizen of the United States, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state in which he shall be chosen. What part of that is not true?
Okay, I was thinking of Clinton.
All right.
She was in New York.
All right. She was a senator, and yeah, we'll get to that later. Okay? So, there is a piece that is, I'm going to raise this a little bit so that I can reach around it a little better. Sit, stay. There's a piece here that was superseded by an amendment, but I'm going to talk about it anyways, because one of the things that the left loves to try to derail the Constitution about is the entire idea of slavery and the 3/5 clause, and that comes in as part of the census clause. So how are we going to decide how to apportion representatives? Well, we have to count all the people who live in the state, count all the citizens, and if you're going to apportion by by population, you have to know the population. That's why they do the census every 10 years, is because they have to count all the people and figure out how many representatives each state gets. But the piece that was taken out here, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included in this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. What the heck does all of that mean? Representatives, number of people who are going to get elected to the House, and direct taxes. Ooh, here's a piece we get left out. Taxes initially were apportioned by per capita, by head count. So they would divvy up the cost of the federal government, divide that by population, and say, here's your bill, Virginia, here's your bill, New York, here's your bill, Connecticut. This is how much you owe the federal government. So if you're talking about people paying taxes, you're going to include all of the people who live there, right? Including those bound to service for a term of years. Those were the indentured servants, the people who said, okay, if you pay my passage from England, I'll work for you for 7 years. So that's what bound to service for a term of years was, okay? They got counted in full. And not excluding Indians not taxed. Well, why wouldn't you include the Indians? Because they're not paying taxes, so we're not going to apportion the tax bills due from the states by people who aren't paying the tax. And we're not going to apportion representatives according to the population of people who aren't being represented. That's fair, right? And then 3/5 of all other persons. And this is where the leftists say, well, they counted blacks as 3/5 of a person. No, actually not. It was the South that wanted all the black slaves to be counted in full. Why? Power. More representatives. Power in the House. It was the abolitionist states that wanted no slaves to be counted. Why? Power for them. The left turns this completely on its head. This clause was a compromise to placate the slave-owning states and give them enough power that they felt like they were okay, weren't going to be railroaded by the abolitionist states, and placated the North, the abolitionist states, to say that the slave-owning states didn't have too much power. Now, the funny thing here is when it talks about direct taxes. So one of the things that the slave-owning states did was they lied about their slave populations because they didn't want to pay the taxes. They cooked the books of their own numbers of slaves reported to lower their political power so that their tax bills would be lower. This was about taxes and representation. However, it also established in law that slaves are persons. There hadn't been anything written down stating that slaves are persons anywhere before this this clause. One of the other things that the left always says is that we should scorn the culture that wrote the Constitution because they're all a bunch of rich white slave owners. And isn't it strange that we have to understand and be tolerant of and respect every culture in the entire world except the one this country was founded on? And we have to hold that culture and that culture alone to our standards of today. That's a little bit hypocritical, because we can't judge the Muslim cultures, and we can't judge the Asian cultures, and we can't judge African cultures. We can only judge this one against our standards today. (1787), when the Constitution was written, where was slavery legal? Every country in the world. And when the Constitution was ratified in 1789, only 4 of the 13 states had made slavery illegal.
Actually, that's one slave. That's literally just one.
All right, where was I? Actually, excuse me, 1787 it was 4. By the time the Constitution was ratified in 1789, another 1 or 2 had joined the party and had made slavery illegal. But I will also tell you that slavery exists today in every country in the world. Usually not legally, but not always. There are places where it is still legal. And there's plenty of places where it's not legal, where it exists. We call it a different name now. We call it human trafficking. Human trafficking is slavery. It is an evil institution, but it exists everywhere and at all times. I will also point out that the first black slaves brought here were brought here by the British as part of the triangle trade. You can look that up. And they were here for 7 years and then freed, basically treated like indentured servants. Yes?
What is trafficking?
Human trafficking is when they either steal people and sell them into slavery, or go to poor folks and say, we've got good jobs for your daughters cleaning houses for rich people in the big city. Here's the equivalent of 25 cents, let us take her, and then they sell her into a brothel. Or they say, we can sneak you into the United States to live where you can live off of welfare, and the price for that is you sexually service every man in the group until you get here. And then when you get here, you end up, again, working in a brothel. It's mainly women who get sold into slavery these days, but not exclusively. But that's what human trafficking is. Where was I? Where was I when I got interrupted by the question? Sorry, I'm fighting a headache, so I'm a little bit not with it tonight. Excuse me? The British brought, thank you, the British brought the first black slaves here. They were treated as indentured servants and released and given land after 7 years. The first slave owner to go to court to fight to keep his slaves was a black slave owner. And when well, I don't have the details, so I'll leave that out. But the first one who go to court to say that these people are mine in perpetuity was a black man who went to court. So most of what the left tries to tell you about slavery in this country is wrong, because, as Reverend Clark said, he who hates the truth loves a lie. Exactly. So, the 3/5 clause, that horrible slave-promoting clause, was an abolitionist clause. And it's part of the census clause. All right. That's too many pages. All right. There's a little bit of stuff in section 2 about how they're going to start out. They basically made a good guess as to population and said, okay, you get 2 and you get 3 and you get 1 and you get 4. Right? When vacancies happen, the executive of that state, governor or whatever they call him, will call an election to fill those vacancies. The House itself chooses its own speaker and its other officers, and it has the sole power of impeachment. So what's impeachment? Reverend Clark talked about impeachment. What is impeachment? It's like bringing someone to court. It's bringing charges against someone. Charges that they are not fulfilling their duties under the Constitution. So it's the House of Representatives that brings charges of impeachment. All right. 2, 3, according to respective numbers. All right. 1, 9. Okay, that's later. Good. Section 3 talks about the Senate. So here's the powers of the Senate and the senators, who are going to be the ambassadors of the state interests to the federal government. They're watching out for the interests of their state. The representatives are watching out for the interests of the people. The senators are watching out for the interests of the state. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state. They serve for 6 years. Well, why 6? The House is 2, the President's 4, the Senate is 6. So they're in office for 3 terms of representatives and 1.5 terms of presidents. What advantage might that be for them in terms of the length of their vision? They're not looking at a 2-year election cycle. They're not looking at a 4-year, what can I get done as the executive in 4 years. They've got a longer view. And isn't that appropriate for people who are supposed to be ambassadors for another sovereign entity? They've got a long view, not just how's this going to affect things this year or this legislative session or this presidential session, but longer. They're supposed to be statesmen looking at a longer term, looking farther into the future at the effects and ramifications. And this pulls into how we pick the senators. No person shall be a senator who shall not have attained to the age of 30 years. So the House was 25, the Senate 30. Older, more life experience, hopefully a little wiser. And originally they were chosen by the state legislatures. Now, if you're chosen by the state legislature of your state, whose interests are you going to be looking out for? The states. If you're chosen by the people, again, whose interests are you going to be looking out for? In theory, the people, probably more likely your own these days. So when they passed the 17th Amendment, and sorry to jump ahead a little, but this is important, when they passed the 17th Amendment, switching the election of senators to the popular vote in the states lost their ambassadors. There was nobody left as the gatekeepers to look out for the interests of the states. And you can date the encroachment of federal action into areas reserved for state control to the passage of the 17th Amendment. That's when it really rocketed up. Now, senators are elected every 6 years, but they split them up into sets of 3. And it sort of doesn't matter how they split them up. So every 2 years, 1/3 of the senators get elected. So there's always people in office who are coming into office who are brand new, people who've been there for a while, people who've been there for longer still, and the people who just left. All right, the Vice President of the United States, 30 years old, been a citizen of the United States for 9 years. Again, more experience, longer residence, and who has to be an inhabitant of the state where they're chosen when they're elected. So that answers the question about Mrs. Clinton. She was a resident of New York when she was elected, despite the fact that she sort of snuck in under the wire and had no understanding of the state's requirements. She was a resident, or at least owned a house there and used it as her legal address. The Vice President of the United States shall be President of the Senate. So he's the head of the Senate in title. But he doesn't have any vote unless they're equally divided. Remember, 2 from every state, so there's always an even number of senators. So if they're completely deadlocked and 50 vote one way and 50 vote the other. The vice president is the one who gets the deciding vote. The senators choose their other officers, and they also get a president pro tempore, basically somebody who gets to act like the head of the group when the vice president is busy doing other things. The Senate, remember the House was the only place that had the power to bring charges under impeachment, right? Impeachment, we bring the charges. The Senate is the court system that has the trial. So it's not like you can have all the senators want to gang up on someone. They can't have a trial unless the House has brought charges. And if the House has it in for someone, they can't get rid of them unless the Senate gets involved. Here's some of the checks and balances. All right? The House brings the charges. The trial is held in the Senate. When they are sitting for that purpose of trials of impeachments, they shall be on oath or affirmation. I mean, they have to swear to do their job properly. When the President of the United States is on trial for impeachment, the Chief Justice of the High Court will preside. Not just the senators. Again, checks and balances. If the entirety of Congress has it in for the President, even then, they can't necessarily railroad somebody into a conviction and removal from office just because they can't stand them. If it's the President on trial, it's the Chief Justice of the High Court who's going to preside over that trial. And the standard for conviction is 2/3 have to vote guilty. Judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. So the only thing the Senate can do is say, okay, you did bad things, you are being removed from office, and you can no longer run for office, and you can not be appointed to any office. That's it. You're out of the public sphere. Yeah. Go home and write your memoirs. But the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law. So if they're removed from office and they really did something that was not just a dereliction of their duty or not upholding the Constitution, but they actually did something that broke the law, they could then come under charges by the lower courts for crimes. So all that impeachment does is, the most that impeachment can do is take somebody out of office. A lot of times, even if they do find somebody guilty, they basically say, bad boy, no biscuit, now go back. Section 4, times, manners, places of holding elections shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. So who decides when you're going to have elections and how exactly you're going to choose your representatives, and then the state legislatures, the senators as well? It's the states that make that decision. That's not federally mandated. And here's one. The Congress shall assemble at least once in every year. Now, this gets glossed over and ignored, but it's actually kind of a crucial piece. How much work were they supposed to be doing at a national, federal level if they have to be told you have to meet at least once? How much work is that? Are they supposed to be in session 11 months out of every year and just like take off a few vacations here and there to go campaign some more? They're supposed to be busy every hour of every day finding new ways to torment us? No, it says, shall assemble at least once a year. So guys, there's not going to be much for you to do, but you got to go at least once a year. And they get to pick the day. They establish by law when they have to show up. Section 5, each house shall be the judge of the elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members. And a majority of each shall constitute a quorum to do business. So, if the House or the Senate thinks that the election for one of their members was rigged or crooked, they can refuse. And there have been cases where they have refused to let someone take their position because the election was crooked. So here's more checks and balances. The states establish when they're going to have their elections and under what circumstances, and the House and the Senate can say, that was not a fair election. That was rigged. We are not going to let Mr. Smith, who's just been elected, take his seat because it was not an appropriate election. And there have been occasions where they've done that. All right, and a majority of each shall constitute a quorum to do business. What's a quorum? Basically means there's enough of us here that we can take action. So it has to be at least, a majority is 50% plus 1. Right? There have to be at least half of them there or they can't do any business. But a smaller number may adjourn from day to day and may be authorized to compel the attendance of the absent manors in a manner and under penalties as each house may provide. So you can have smaller subsets that go off to like investigate stuff and come back with reports, or that's what they call like the subcommittees who go off and do specific tasks, but it has to be brought back to the entire House or the entire Senate for action. Each house has to keep a journal of its proceedings and from time to time publish the same. That's the congressional record. Now, there's a very interesting little bit about the congressional record, and that is that the people who go up and make speeches on the House floor, those are all transcribed word for word and published in the congressional record, except that the representative or senator, before it's published, can go in and say, no, take this out, add that. I didn't say that. Yes, I said it, but I didn't say it. Okay. So they actually publish an edited version of what actually goes on, but they do publish a record of all their proceedings. All right. If any parts in their judgment require secrecy, they can leave those bits out, which makes sense if they're talking about something to do with national security. One of the definitions we'll talk about tomorrow of treason is giving aid and comfort to your enemies. So if you're going to talk about something that if the enemy knew they could make use of, you wouldn't publish that part. That's sensible. And the yeas and nays, yeses and nos of the members of either house on any question shall, at the desire of 1/5 of those present, be entered on the journal. So if 20% of them say, we want, all in favor say yay, yay. All opposed say no, no. All right, 20% of you say, okay, we need a head count here because we couldn't tell whether the yays had it or the nays had it. So we're going to count. If 20% say we're going to count, it has to be counted. And neither house during the session of Congress will adjourn for more than 3 days in a row unless the other house consents. Section 6, the senators and representatives are going to get paid. That makes sense. They're leaving their businesses, they're leaving their farms, they're traveling by horse and buggy or just by horse or by feet. Right? And they have to stay at inns and buy food on the way. They're going to get paid. Fair enough. The payment will be set by law, paid out of the treasury, and they shall in all cases except treason, felony, and breach of the peace be privileged from arrest during their attendance at the session of their respective houses. So unless you commit treason, commit a felony, or breach the peace, and have a brawl on the public streets, you're not going to be arrested for while you're in session. So no parking tickets, right? And in going into and returning from the same. And this is one of those areas where I said that there are specific things in the Constitution that address items in the Declaration. One of the things that that King George would have done was set the legislative meeting someplace inconvenient, and when people went to go to travel there, they would get arrested on trumped-up charges to prevent them from attending the legislative session. Key thing here, Section 7, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. So that means the House of Representatives has everything to do with the money, which is appropriate because they're representing the people. It's their friends, their relatives, their neighbors, and their fellow townsmen's money that they are spending, choosing to spend. So one of Congress's jobs is to refuse to spend the people's money on anything unconstitutional. If the people in the House understood this and had the guts to act on it, we could get rid of most of the unconstitutional layers of government in a heartbeat, because they don't have to get the Senate to agree, they don't have to get the President to agree. They are the ones who have to say, we are going to appropriate money. And if they say there is no constitutional justification for the Department of Education, it doesn't get another dime. Not for salaries, not for heat, not for lights, not to buy computers, not to print anything. They're done. They can go to work every day and sit in a dark building and do nothing and not get paid for it. How long do you think they're going to do that? Not very. So, the burden of the House is to refuse to fund unconstitutional parts of the government, and they don't do it. Unfortunately, I'm already running out of time. Section 8. There's two key sections in all of here. Section 8 is the places where Congress actually has the authority to act. And depending on how carefully you divide them out, there's either 17, 18, 19, right? So they get the power to tax in places where they have justification, constitutional jurisdiction to act. They can regulate, make regular, even playing field, commerce with foreign nations and with the states and the Indian tribes. To make regular means to treat the same. One of the problems under the Articles of Confederation was that states were treating other states as if they were foreign countries, and every time something crossed a border, there was another customs duty to pay. Establish a rule for naturalization, uniform laws on bankruptcies, coining money, punishing counterfeiting, establishing post offices, making patents and trademarks, tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court, define and punish piracies, declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal. James Bond operates under letters of marque and reprisal. All right? Basically, if you have to go off somebody in the name of king and country, we're not going to put you up on charges. To raise and support monies, to raise and support armies. No appropriation of money lasts longer than 2 years. Why? Because they were afraid of a standing army and they had the militia, which is all of us. To provide and maintain a navy. No time limit, because navies were super important and they weren't worried about a navy oppressing the people because they're out at sea. Make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, to provide for calling forth the militia. That's all they have jurisdiction over. You see anything in there about education, environment, energy, Health and Human Services, Department of Education? No, it's not there. It's not there. The only places where the federal government has jurisdiction over you as a civilian is if you counterfeit, commit treason, or go bankrupt. Those are the only 3 places where the federal government should have any effect on your life as an individual person. To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So they can make all laws necessary and proper for those powers, those 16, 17, 18 items. That's it. Section 9, migration or importation of such persons. This is another anti-slavery provision. We can tax the importation of slaves. And after 1808, they're basically giving them 20 years. After 1808, you can't import anymore. All of the territories and states that were admitted later on as slave states, there's no jurisdiction for doing that. No jurisdiction at all. Privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, bring me the body, bring the person here, shall not be suspended. No bill of attainder is when they take away all your civil rights and privileges and all your property as punishment for a crime, sometimes a made-up crime. No ex post facto law, which means that if they make it illegal tomorrow for people to eat hot dogs, they can't arrest you for having eaten a hot dog today, because today it was legal. No titles of nobility will be granted by the United States. And then Section 10 are the very few things the states agree that they will never do. They're not going to make separate treaties, alliances, or confederations. They're not going to grant their own letters of marque and reprisal. They're not going to make anything but gold and silver coin. They're not going to pass any bills of attainder or ex post facto laws of their own, and they're not going to grant titles of nobility, and they're not going to impair the obligation of contracts. All right. They won't keep their own armies, and they won't keep big navies. They're allowed to keep a couple of small ships. There was something else in here that jumped out at me that I had neglected. Questions? There's something here that I forgot that I'll bring up tomorrow morning. It's all as clear as mud? Thin mud? Yes?
What was it you said? It wasn't about the Department of Education and all that other stuff. You said it was just about
Article 1, Section 8. If it's not there, they don't have jurisdiction over it. There's nothing about education in Article 1, Section 8. Yes, sir.
The House Representative being, say, 2/3 agreement or whatever to get an impeachment?
No, they don't need that to bring charges. That the Senate needs that to convict. That was the piece. That actually comes in later. The Senate, remember, is going to be the elder statesmen, the long view, and they're going to have another piece to role to play, and that piece is going to come in tomorrow morning when we talk about Article 2, the executive. Okay? Any other questions? All right. Again, I'm going to be around until like Thursday, so if you do have questions, talk to me.